Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to address yet another argument which somewhat indirectly has been leveled against the proponents of eternal human longevity. And this argument, I think, really needs to be challenged because it comes from Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand, in general, is a philosopher who has a lot of rational ideas. I agree with most of the fundamental principles that Ayn Rand advocates. However, in some of her particular reasoning, at least if that reasoning is applied to the wrong context, she can be off target, and she can be off target in such a way as to retard further progress. Now, the argument that is often leveled is that achieving indefinite human longevity would turn human beings into Ayn Rand's description of the immortal, indestructible robot. On page 15 of The Virtue of Selfishness, Ayn Rand writes, "To make this point fully clear, try to imagine an immortal, indestructible robot, an entity which moves and acts, but which cannot be affected by anything, which cannot be changed in any respect, which cannot be damaged, injured, or destroyed. Such an entity would not be able to have any values. It would have nothing to gain or to lose. It could not regard anything as for or against it, as serving or threatening its welfare, as fulfilling or frustrating its interests. It could have no interests and no goals." Now, with regard to that passage, there are several things that could be said in relation to prolonging human life indefinitely and lifting the death sentence that hangs over all of us. Now, the first thing that can be said is at no point in time will human beings become the immortal, indestructible robots that Ayn Rand describes. And the very simple reason for this is that our existence is physical, and it is contingent on certain physical prerequisites being fulfilled. Now, the moment one of these physical prerequisites is not fulfilled, our existence ceases. And this will always be the case, even if we no longer have a necessary upper limit on our lifespans. For example, people who attempt to live longer, people who succeed in that attempt by successfully combating senescence, could still get run over by a car. They could still experience a plane crash. And certainly, if it is ever the case that death by senescence and death by the myriad of diseases which kill many human beings today can be averted, then human beings will try to avert the other possibilities of death, say by developing safer modes of transportation, or by engaging in fewer wars, so that they do not stand the risk of being killed, as frequently at least. So, it's possible to reduce the likelihood that one can be destroyed, but the possibility is always there. And also, because human beings have free will, they always have at least the option of choosing to undermine the physical prerequisites of their own lives. Now, I don't believe that any sane, rational human being would actually choose to pursue that option, but that option is nonetheless there. If anybody wants to commit suicide by immediate means or by a steady, long-term deterioration of one's organism, there's virtually nothing in the world that could ever prevent that. So, even with indefinite longevity, human beings will not become immortal, indestructible robots that Ayn Rand describes. They will always be vulnerable to something. And when we manage to avoid one kind of peril, other kinds of perils might even become more pressing. Say, if we do manage to live for hundreds of thousands of years, all of a sudden, we will be much more subject to the long-term geological fluctuations of the Earth's climate that are not very noticeable because we simply don't live long enough to experience massive changes. Say, the cycle of ice ages. One ice age occurs on average every 8,000 years. Human beings so far have not lived 8,000 years, so most of us don't really worry about what's going to happen when huge glaciers advance over the continents. But if we do live for that long, that will become a pressing problem for our own lifetimes. And likewise, the longer we live, the greater the likelihood that we'll experience some kind of global cataclysm, like, say, a major volcano or an asteroid hitting the Earth. And so human ingenuity, human resources will have to be devoted toward fighting that. And I believe that's a very good thing to happen, because if human beings didn't have very long lifespans, they would not have the long-term orientation necessary to devote resources toward combating these perils. But even if such an immortal, indestructible robot could exist, and that robot, in every other respect, was identical to human beings, somehow it had human biological processes, human ways of thinking, just made out of very, very strong materials that didn't deteriorate or that automatically renewed themselves, that could automatically repair any injury that accrued to the robot, I still don't believe that Ayn Rand is correct here. Because the fear of death is not the sole motivator for human actions. It is not the sole motivator by far. I would say, actually, most great things that human beings accomplish are a result of positive motivations, not negative motivations. And Ayn Rand, to a certain extent at least, acknowledged this when she said that achieving life is not the equivalent of avoiding death. At least in the short term, you don't have to do very much to avoid death. You just have to stay out of trouble. You could just sit there and eat, drink, make sure you're warm, sleep. You'll avoid death, but that's not a full life, according to Ayn Rand. Obviously, to have a full life, you need to avoid death. Survival is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And many thinkers in the Objectivist school have extended this to mean that survival is not enough. For a full life, you also need flourishing. And I agree with that notion. I believe that there are other positive motivations. For example, the desire to see oneself create something, to see something originating from one's mind and become embodied in the physical reality. To take some kind of aesthetic pleasure from a particular object or activity does not require even a thought of death. Moreover, to appreciate certain kinds of patterns in existence that are present in art, in technology, and even in games does not require any thought of death. Many people play games, even if those games do not directly contribute anything to their survival. Now, I don't believe, however, that doing so is irrational. Rather, it's another creative way to channel the activities of the human mind. The human mind essentially creates its own field of endeavor, so to speak. It creates a rule system within which it operates. And by operating within that rule system, it exercises its full potential, whereas just by sitting there and only doing the things that are necessary absolutely to survive, it would have missed some essential part of its functioning. So, creating art, music, scientific discoveries does not rely on having to die in the future, and it doesn't even rely on the threat of death. I think the immortal, indestructible robot, of course, might not engage in precisely the same activities as we do. It would probably not have to worry about earning its next meal by working for somebody else. But it could still paint a painting, just because it likes to see its mental processes, which in this scenario would be very much like ours, have some kind of external consequence, some kind of embodiment in the external reality. I believe this is a vital component of flourishing. So, this fear of death and this avoidance of death, as Ayn Rand herself elsewhere admitted, is not the same as achieving life. There's more to life than that. And as a result, I think the immortal, indestructible robot argument fails on multiple counts.